Good day, good day. So we're going to be looking at the leadership of Jesus and Nehemiah and how they kind of tie together, and a couple differences that are in that, and some things that I found pretty helpful as a developing leader. And from reading the book Leading Like Jesus, we know that leadership happens anytime we influence the thinking, behavior, or development of another person. And this is something we both see in Jesus. I mean, we see Jesus doing that with his disciples. He encourages them, sends them out, and they act like him and thought, action, and works and all of that. And we see Nehemiah uplifting the Israelites to rebuild the towns of Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls and all of that. So we see both of them kind of walking in this type of leadership. But there's 6 specific character things that I'd like to go over that were fairly similar between the two of them. And the first being that they were both very prayerful leaders. Jesus often went away from those around him to spend time and seek the face of his Father. Then he would usually come back empowered, and we see him doing that before choosing his disciples. But Nehemiah often did that as well. I think we see him praying like 13 times throughout the several chapters, and we see it straight out the gate from verses 5 to 11. He's just pleading for God to let his people come back to Jerusalem, that they would be able to rebuild the walls, and that the Persian king would let him do so. And we see that actually panning out and working. So we see, that he's a very prayerful leader. And the second one is that Nehemiah and Jesus were both very humble men who really broke and served their people. Nehemiah, his whole mission was to rebuild Jerusalem. It wasn't this selfish act. He wanted to see his people return to their homeland, return in the glory of God, and to be his covenant people again. And he prayed for repentance. He prayed, and he did everything that he could. They even had everybody sign this pledge back to God. So he was very passionate and very humble in his pursuits for that. But we also see him defending the poor from rich creditors that were exploiting them in this like servant slavery debtorship. And he actually wants to make reforms in that. So we see him really out there for his people and serving them. And obviously Jesus, the ultimate leader of servant leadership, he defended the outcasts. He was often out there with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, and he was, bringing redemption and hope to those who had none, to the marginalized and to the hopeless. And he brought hope. And we see Jesus being the most humble of all, and he came not to be served but to serve, as it says in Matthew 20 to 28, I believe. Thirdly, they both had a vision and purpose. I think this is a pretty big one. Nehemiah wanted to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and really return Jerusalem to some sort of former glory, if you want to put it like that. But he desired for God's people to return to their homeland, this desire to rebuild Jerusalem, to kind of have this people brought back and restored. And Jesus kind of similarly wanted to rebuild or build God's kingdom, although the difference between the two of them here is that Jesus wanted to build a spiritual kingdom that would ultimately captivate the hearts and the minds of everybody in the world, not just the people who were, not just the Israelite people, And one thing that I noticed between the two of these things was that the humility and purpose of both of these leaders was kind of tied together. It was in that humility and in this serving is where they found their purpose. And for me, that really reminds me that I find my purpose in my submission to God, and at the same time with my heart of serving others. So I think that really stood out to me while reading about Nehemiah and leading like Jesus. Fourthly, both of them were really involved with their communities, and by that I mean they didn't do their missions alone. They didn't go after their vision their vision or purpose alone. They had a community. They delegated authority. We see that with Nehemiah as he divides up the buildings to different families. He lets his brother Hananiah take charge over Jerusalem, and they have members of the community become guards and watchmen over the city, and he gives that responsibility and ownership to others other than just keeping it for himself. And we see Jesus doing the same thing with his disciples, empowering them for this mission of building the kingdom. And even after he left, they continued and prospered to what we see Christianity today. We're talking about Jesus still. And that kind of ties into this next difference between Nehemiah and Jesus, and is that Nehemiah, once he left, the people kind of returned to their old ways. Some of the change that he brought kind of started to go back. And then he had to come back and bring the people back to repentance. But as we see in Jesus, when he left, he had empowered the disciples to really take ownership and to keep driving this mission forward, which they did. So there's a bit of a difference there between the two. And we see in leading like Jesus that leadership is really important when the leader is not present. It's important about leadership what's important about leadership is not what happens when the leader is present, but what happens when the leader is not there. So the fifth thing that they both had in common is that they were really dependent on God. And as it's described in leading like Jesus, leaders depend on God for everything they need, whether it be love, self-worth, and security. And this is something Nehemiah did when he was struggling with these people that ultimately wanted to kill him for what he was doing in rebuilding the walls. He relied on God, and he said, no, I'm going to keep building this. This needs to be done. And he did it, and God protected him. And we also see him relying on God to sway the Persian king to let him actually go out and do this. And he ended up having the Persian king send men alongside with him to do this. So we see him being very dependent on God for this thing to actually get done. And we see obviously Jesus, he was empowered by the Father. He would go and spend time with him and seek his will. And he was very reliant on the Father to give him the strength that he needed. We see him praying in the Garden of Gethsemane for his Father to ultimately give him the strength to go through with this, even though at the time that he didn't really want to. We see this huge dependence on the Father, and really showing us how to depend on the Father is very powerful. And something that I've taken away from this is that it's so important to be dependent on God and really to have him be the authority, not any man, not any person, but at the end of the day we stand before God and he judges us. So it's really important to have him as our focus to please and not man. And lastly, they were both men of godly character, and this I think is the most important thing, because character is like the most important part of leadership. And we see Nehemiah was a super prayerful man. He was devoted to the laws. He adhered to the laws. He was like a top-notch follower of the covenant, it seems. Like he was humble, as we talked about before, but he displayed this steadfastness in this face of opposition, and he was really all about what God wanted to do. And we see this the same as Jesus. His authority was in the Father, and we see him being this perfect follower of the living God. He was full of grace and love for others. He was this super empathetic dude, and Jesus really ultimately is the definition of love. Love your neighbor as yourself, and all of those things that he taught is very powerful. So which actually brings us to a bit of a difference between the two, between Nehemiah and Jesus, is that Jesus, while being crucified by his enemies, he prayed for forgiveness for them, while Nehemiah, he asked for his enemies to be cursed. There's a couple times, which fair enough. I mean, they wanted to kill him, but he was kind of cursing his enemies and that they wouldn't get repentance. And we see Jesus kind of being a bit of the opposite, who was showing love to his enemies and even as they were killing him. So there's this bit of a difference between the two when it comes to that. But yeah, essentially they were both really godly men, and that's something that's really stands out to me, and not only from just reading this, but also as seeing so much moral failure, it seems, throughout the past couple of years from Christian leaders. It really drives home this importance of being right with God and having my heart right with God above all things, because that's the most important thing ultimately. And when you do end up messing up or having not the best character, it can actually throw away everything that you've done in the past, regardless of how good it was, because it's stained by this lack of character. So character is so important for leadership, not only to bless those around you, but to have actually a long-lasting legacy.